Hi everyone, you've tuned into Anime Huddle coming straight from Radio LUMS, and this is your RJ Namrah speaking. Welcome back to another episode with us, and this time we're going to talk about a show that you've probably almost definitely seen while growing up, the childhood classic, Avatar: The Last Airbender. The series aired on Nickelodeon from 2005 to 2008, and was a behemoth of a show in terms of the impact it had. Avatar took the episodic formula found in other animated cartoons of the time on Nickelodeon and Cartoon Network, and combined that with a linear storyline. The result was a show that you could watch on TV without watching prior episodes, while simultaneously having it play into the larger story. Combined with outstanding animation, creative voice acting, and appealing actors, this made Avatar a series that demonstrated the medium of animation being capable of more than the standard episodic cartoons being aired at the time. So if your memory is a bit hazy, let's review the lore of the world itself for a minute. People in this world possess one of the four elements: water, fire, earth, and air. And so the world is divided into four nations centered around one specific element. The system is kept in balance by the Avatar, who is the only person able to manipulate all four elements. The main conflict of the story arose when the current Avatar, a 12-year-old boy named Aang, had disappeared for 100 years, allowing for the Fire Nation to break the balance and start a war against the other nations. When Aang returned, he had to stop the Fire Lord in order to save the balance of the whole world. Part of Avatar's charm is how simplistic and symbolic it is at the same time. Take the unique color scheme that represents each nation's element and their surroundings. Why do you think Katara and Sokka wear their trademark blue clothes? It's because it easily allows them to be associated with the Water Tribe. So you have these clear divisions that the show uses with visual tools like color that let you keep up. For example, red has often been a color to inspire fear, whether it's because it's the same color as the clothes of the Fire Nation soldiers, or because red is associated with fire itself, something both precarious and powerful. As the Sun Warrior Chief told Aang, fire is life, not just destruction. Along with that, every nation's culture has been inspired from the real world. Keeping the Water Tribe in focus, their clothes are similar to that of the Inuit, and their ships resemble Polynesian vessels. So you get this level of cultural and literary depth that you can genuinely appreciate because of how tastefully done it is. It's not something you think of as appropriation. And since the writers are taking inspiration from the real world, the politics of the four nations are also organized in that way. For example, the Fire Nation resembles Imperial Japan very closely, and so in the absence of the Avatar, their military expansion has an instinctive and all-encompassing logic to it. The Earth Kingdom is very similar to the Qing Empire, the last Chinese dynasty, with the attire of the Earth King, the hairstyle of the Ba Sing Se native men, and the decrepit state of the Earth Kingdom overall, which alludes to the deterioration the Qing Empire was facing near the end of their reign. So now that we've gone briefly over the background of Avatar to let you settle in for this episode, let's touch base on the plot, our characters, and our remaining qualms about the show. So going back to the plot, Avatar was unique in their airing time for a decision that they made. As the show gained more popularity and further seasons began airing, they shifted focus away from the episodic nature of the early episodes of Season 1 to focus more on the overarching plot. This shift was a major reason why the show succeeded. Plenty of other animated shows at the time had an overarching storyline, like Danny Phantom or Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but it would often have to be sidelined for the general appeal of the episodic formula. So the main cast of Avatar develops specific goals that get answered over the course of the season. For instance, at the very start of Season 2, the gang starts searching for an earthbending master who can teach Aang. The show also avoids the pitfalls that come with having explicitly demarcated good and bad people. Through Iroh and Zuko, we see the politics of the Fire Nation as more than just being a force of evil. The later seasons do a fantastic job at exploring the character arcs of both these characters, while still tying those arcs to the main story of the protagonist Aang, and not sidelining his mission to defeat the Fire Lord. Avatar also had a unique way of dividing their seasons. by referring to them as books. In anime terms, think of every new division of a season as being a new training arc, which culminates with Aang demonstrating not just his physical, but also his mental and spiritual growth. But Aang's growth always comes with a catch. He's got this avatar state as his ultimate trump card that he can access, in which all the avatars who had existed prior would come together, in Aang's body of course, to help him. But even though the mastering of the avatar state took Aang 3 entire seasons, it always felt like a cheat code that could allow him to win in any situation. Yes, the avatar state has a very major weakness, that if Aang was killed while in the avatar state, the avatar cycle would stop. But apart from Azula, no one ever came close to being a threat, and it can be argued that even Azula only succeeded due to having Aang distracted. In the final showdown between Aang and Ozai, Aang is on the back foot for the first part of the fight, but not because he's weaker. Instead, he's still dealing with his inner conflict of potentially taking a life. However, when he's forced into a corner, Aang manages to unlock the avatar state through what can only be described as pure luck, a rock piercing his back and aligning his chakra points. After this, he proceeds to wipe the floor with Ozai, which lifts any pressure on Aang to overcome his conflict within his battle against Ozai. The avatar state, while very satisfying to watch, just feels as though it erases any individual power or responsibility for Aang, and lets him get out an easy route as his fallback option. But with all that said, we can't talk about Avatar's plot without mentioning its iconic cast of characters. Nearly every character brings something unique to the table, but let's talk about some of our more underappreciated characters. One character that often gets overshadowed is Sokka. At the start of the series, Sokka is a teenage boy who's been left by his father at home to take care of the Southern Warden tribe. Given that every other able-bodied man from the tribe went to fight against the Fire Nation, Sokka is shown to be deeply insecure about being left behind. And because of that, he tries to overcompensate, and is a rather abrasive character for the first few episodes. He often makes snide and sexist remarks about his sister Katara's prowess with waterbending, as well as to other women such as the Kyoshi warriors. His initial personality is somewhat understandable when you consider that the Southern Warden tribe had itself created a strict gender division in their choice to only let the men fight and left women and children at home. But Sokka also is shown to overcome this gender division that he created between what a man is capable of doing and what a woman is capable of doing. For example, as a consequence of being humiliated in combat by the very same Kyoshi warriors, he learns that the way he's dealing with his insecurities is not healthy. He learned a pretty hard lesson for someone who grew up and lived their life with a very rigid idea of masculinity. And the show doesn't try to make him fit that model of masculinity he grew up around and wanted to emulate, but rather lets him find his own place. Like with his wit and peacemaking skills, which became the glue holding the team together. This became really apparent when Sokka left to train with a sword master, and in those few days the entire dynamic between Aang, Katara, and Toph fell apart. And what about our fan favorite character, Iroh? Despite being from the enemy side, the Fire Nation, Iroh radiates a sort of energy that is rarely found, not just in animated shows but in any show in general. Iroh is the embodiment of what a mentor-type character can be, and while there is humor and serenity within him, there is also cold logic and realism that you rarely see in these type of mentor characters. Although his character isn't the major focus of the show, the writers use him as a vector from which to instill some much-needed wisdom into the main team, as well as to act as a guiding pillar for Zuko. But he's far from perfect, being shown in the past to have been blinded by the brainwashing of the Fire Nation, which cost him the life of his son, following which he transformed from being the prospective heir of the Fire Nation to a lowly general, sidelined for failing to adhere to the warlike ideologies of the Fire Nation. But his questionable past is precisely what redeems his present. He could have become the Fire Lord and continued the legacy of his family and the Empire, but he chose to carve a path for himself and his nephew away from the dogmas of the Fire Nation. And keep in mind, Iroh was a person who had power in every sense of the word, in terms of strength, status, being cultured. And it wasn't as if he was evil prior to changing his path in life. He was still the same funny, empathetic person we saw him as Iroh, but rather, his son's death taught him his priorities in life, with family as being the most important and everything else being meaningless if you lose them. He also represents a far-sightedness about the cyclical aspect of war that we could learn from. Rather than achieving vengeance for his son's death from Ba Sing Se, he comes to the hard realization that it was the Fire Nation to blame, with their obsession of ruthless war for supposed greatness, and that was sending these young men to their deaths. One scene about Iroh really comes to mind, when Iroh and Zuko have been reduced to begging on the streets, and a man makes Iroh dance for a gold piece. Zuko's response at the end of the situation is to say, "How humiliating," but Iroh says, "Such a kind man." One last character who really stood out for me is Toph. It's rare to see representations of disabled characters, although diversity is something that's lauded like a checklist these days. And it's even rarer when these disabled characters are more than their disabilities. Toph, while is blind, the show avoids giving any sort of predictable dialogue surrounding her disability. She's not the saintly blind girl free from any faults, nor is she vicious, angry, almost contagious in what's her perceived deformity. Never once does the show ever make her being blind the focus of her sadness or lamenting. Instead, we've got a very tough, cool-headed young girl who holds her own in all situations. But the writers of Avatar don't do her the injustice of making her one-dimensional. We often see moments in which Toph doesn't exactly behave her best, but she's always made to face the consequences of her actions and learns and grows. For example, when she learned a very hard lesson about the consequences of stealing through getting arrested. And other characters like Katara, they don't let her off the hook when she's done something wrong. And speaking of other characters, it's particularly interesting to see how they interact with her. Never once is she treated as a liability, and sometimes characters even have moments in which they forget she's blind. But sure, her being blind does mean that she has to be accommodated differently, like when Sokka often guides her in walking, but it's always depicted as something natural and free of burden. The most refreshing thing about Toph's character is that we've got something interesting going on, in which the typical codified expectations for the representation of disabled bodies in media does not occur. And Avatar is very careful to not commit one error that such representations often do, which is with pity. Often, pity is what is the most humiliating act one can carry out towards another person. But Toph, till the end, remains a character who is more than her disability, the social baggage that has also been lumped in together with it. Now that we've heaped all this praise on the show, we need to address some of the limitations or deconstruct some of the criticism surrounding it, and whether that criticism is justified. One of the most popular critiques is that for a show that was concentrated on not creating demarcations between good and evil, the villain of the show, Ozai, was never fully developed. He's always treated as this overtly evil force of nature, which, while achieving the goal of depicting him as a villain, completely took away any engagement we had with him, and didn't give us any context into him. You might think, what's the point of getting the pity story of a villain? Especially right now, we're seeing this sympathetic gaze towards figures of history in the media, like with the influx of such murder documentaries on Netflix. There's this fascination involved in constructing a villainous figure, and so often giving the villain a voice can be damaging in a wider social context, or come across as sympathetic. But at the same time, if done right, especially in a fictional realm, it can help us understand them more, not to be able to place them better, but to place our surroundings better. And this is where Avatar falls short. We never get any real information on him. In the earlier seasons, we only hear his voice as he commands others, as well as a silhouette of his face. The show actively deprives us of any information on Ozai up until the 3rd season, and instead it depicts him as a one-dimensional character who just wants to rule the world, and that's a really cartoonish goal if you think about it. His motivation is equally absurd, and it's pretty much because he's power-hungry and narcissistic. We never see him outside of being greedy for power, and that is literally the only character trait we're working with him. All of the build-up that Avatar created for him as this faceless, enormous force did a good job in portraying him as unstoppable, but it did very little to make audiences care about him as the figurehead of all this violence. Instead, it mythologizes him, rather than looking at him as flesh and blood engineering the chaos in the four nations. By contrast, the way Azula, who is Ozai's daughter and the central antagonist for books 2 and 3, is involved in the story, makes the final conflict between Zuko and Azula carry a weight to it that the showdown between Aang and Ozai lacked. But again, even with Azula, we're seeing something lacking here. While the show does a good job at portraying the fall of Azula and her utter despair at realizing she was just a pawn for her father and ultimately lost everything, it doesn't do much to acknowledge that Azula suffered just like Zuko did because of Ozai, but in a different way. Because of this, a lot of the complexity behind Azula's character is brushed over, not just by the show, but by fans at large as well. There's this tendency to hold her to a stricter moral code than the rest of the characters. Take Iroh. For most of his adult life, he actively participated in the Fire Nation expeditions. One of those involved a year-long siege of Ba Sing Se, and he even made jokes such as burning Ba Sing Se to the ground. But fans don't really bring this up, and they let him have his moment of redemption. And speaking of redemption, even though Zuko was exiled, he still had a lot of support and love from Iroh. He also first-hand saw the destruction that the Fire Nation caused. But even then, we see a moment in the show in which Zuko goes back to the Fire Nation side and betrays Iroh. Despite Zuko having all this opportunity to change, he doesn't completely manage to do that easily. And Azula, who never had any opportunity to see the world beyond what her father dictated it as, is somehow held to a higher standard than him. This isn't to reduce Azula's actions, but rather to contextualize her as a child who was also abused. Often, abuse isn't just working at an exclusionary level, but also at an inclusionary level, and that's something people tend to forget. Something else that felt underdeveloped in the show was the creation of the secret society, the White Lotus. The development of the White Lotus as the secret order that transcended the four nations and sought to create peace in the entire world was rather rushed. Don't get me wrong, seeing the old masters in action was a treat, but it felt that the only reason why the White Lotus was created was just to create another plot device. It then also creates the question of the absence of the White Lotus throughout the 100-Year War. Had they helped in preventing the fall of Ba Sing Se at the end of Season 2, the situation wouldn't have been as dire as it was throughout the entire third season. For the most part, it seems like the White Lotus members are just glorified old men who sit around and drink tea. But coming back to Avatar as a whole again, Avatar was more than just another animated show. Not only did the show have a universal appeal regardless of age, it also grew with its audience and became a part of our cultural zeitgeist. Maybe that's just a nostalgia speaking, but we can see how even today the internet is rife with discussion and appreciation for this show. And you're going to find that its audience consists of people of all backgrounds and ages. We all knew the airing time like the back of our head and rushed home to watch it. The world of Avatar truly transcended all boundaries between us in this way. And so, with all that said, we've reached the end of this episode. Thank you for tuning into Anime Huddle with Radio LUMS so far, and do look forward to the next episode. See you next time, and goodbye.